Second question I had was how is a person's empathy impacted when living with autism spectrum disorder? Because there's a lot of misconceptions that people with autism don't have any empathy or don't care about people, and are just kind of vacant, which is a big misconception. The four kiddos I work with very much have empathy. They're very curious about emotions and they're very curious about their peers and how they react. Um, a lot of my students are on varying levels of the spectrum, so they express it differently. But in my experience, they've always shown it. It has to be taught, you know, and a lot of that's because their development and their brain is just different. So they need to be taught differently, which is a big part of our job and why we're here. So I was just really curious about how their empathy is impacted or what studies are out there that show that. In a study I found, it talked about autism spectrum traits and em empathetic accuracy. So individuals with higher autism spectrum traits tend to perform worse on empathetic accuracy tasks. So particularly when their trait effective empathy is low. So the role of effective empathy is the ability to sense and recognize others' feelings. You can moderate the relationship between autism spectrum traits and empathetic accuracy. So higher effective empathy can mitigate the negative impacts of autism spectrum traits on empathetic accuracy. And I think that's something that, from my experience, I can agree with, especially with I had three kiddos with autism last year, and I have four kiddos with autism this year. Um, that's very much kind of the display I see. They definitely care. They definitely love their peers, their teachers, their moms, their dads. They definitely have empathy. They can feel for others. They can see that someone is sad. It's just their reaction varies. And they just don't necessarily recognize others' feelings. Like they'll go up and take a toy, and when that friend is upset, they're very surprised. They a lot of times just kind of stare and are like, what?" And in my experience, if you go over and you teach the child, or try to educate them on that, and then teach the other child about that they're still learning and they just have a different way of learning about things, um, that behavior can tend to stop. There's definitely a curiosity. It's just not really understanding people's feelings, from my experience and from what one of the studies I found was saying. In an additional study I researched, the main hypothesis was about social behavior and autism spectrum disorder, and it talked about the problems are related to deficits in assigning rewarding value to social stimuli. So a lot of the times, a child's empathy, or excuse me, is impacted because they have a deficit in understanding that there's a reward value to stimuli. So socializing with friends, they get something back. There's not a direct response where it's like they accomplish a task and they get a reward. It's like when they're engaging with a peer, they don't necessarily gain that social stimuli. So there's not necessarily the motive to engage in it or form it. Additionally, in this study, it found that individuals with autism spectrum disorder, their cognitive empathy is significantly impaired. So they have difficulty adopting other people's perspectives and understanding their thoughts and intentions, why they did what they did, why they're feeling the way they are, why they think the way they do. But it did not show effective empathy, which involves sharing and understanding the feelings of others. There was not a significant difference between individuals with autism spectrum disorder and neurotypical brain development. So this indicates that individuals with autism spectrum disorder may struggle with the cognitive aspects of empathy. Their ability to experience and share emotions with others, though, remain relatively intact, which, again, from my personal experience, I would agree with that. And I feel like that's a pretty accurate representation of what I see and whatnot. So, um, yeah, it answered my question because I didn't necessarily know that or think about it in that way, but once I was reading about it, a lot of that just made sense to me.